With the brief exception of the terrible war, Koreans are still sorely absent in the American mainstream media, culture, and history books. Can you stay here and don't move? I want you to watch absolutely everything while I step out of the store to have lunch. My mother thought that was really weird. Why would he go and have lunch without her? But she said, okay. And she sat there for about 30 minutes, watching, not moving, not going to the bathroom, just watching. And soon, Mr. Park opened the cash register and took money out, and he put it into his pocket. When my father returned, my mother said, Mr. Park took money out of the cash register and put it into his pocket. My father was very sad, and he said, I knew it. Apparently, for the past few months, he couldn't balance the books, and there was always cash missing. So every time my father went to the bathroom or stepped out to get breakfast, more cash would be missing. And when he asked Mr. Park about it, Mr. Park would say, I don't know what you're talking about. My father had needed a witness for Mr. Park's stealing. Now, what happened next is really strange. My father did not confront Mr. Park and accuse him of a crime against the partnership. Instead, my mother withdrew from NYU, from her studies, and decided to work at the store. She told my father, I'll learn and practice English with the customers. With my mother at the shop and my father at the shop, Mr. Park couldn't do anything. And within a month, Mr. Park, who had never had much interest in running a business, because he was very interested in women and alcohol, asked my father if he would like the opportunity to buy him out of the partnership. Mr. Park wanted $15,000, which of course my parents didn't have. So Uncle John got a loan from his company and loaned it to my parents. With him gone and paid off, my parents actually started to realize that this business could turn a profit. And that was our first year in America. Now I want to tell you why any of this matters at all. Every night, I heard new stories from my parents at the dinner table. Because my mother was working at the store 6 days a week, my 10-year-old sister Myung made rice and some sort of entree like fried spam, that other Korean national dish. And my family ate together. What I recall about my childhood dinners is not the food. But what I remember chiefly are the vivid stories. For me, my life at school, as I mentioned before, was not easy. I didn't understand what the other kids were talking about. I was very awkward. I was far too tall for my own good. I had been an early reader in Korea, but I didn't know how to read in English. We didn't have any books at home. I didn't know about the public library then. And we didn't have a television that first year. We had no toys or games. That sounds rather grim, but it wasn't in any way at all. Because at the dinner table, my father and mother told us about their day. They talked to each other and to us. I would hear about Justin, the landlord, who was going to raise the rent again. Or that Uncle John needed a new car. Or that my parents had shared a buttered bagel for breakfast that morning to save money. They told us about their uncles and aunts and my cousins back in Korea who wrote them letters on blue aerograms. Back then, much like now, there were few, if any, Asians on TV. There were no movies with Asians in them or Koreans, and their stories were not in newspapers, magazines, or in any of the books that I read at school. There was one other Korean girl at the school, and because, I don't know why, she didn't want to be my friend. But she was really helpful because she taught me the word for 화장실. She said, just say bathroom, bathroom. So if it wasn't for her, I would probably be suffering some more. I was very lost and lonely. However, because of my mother's and father's stories of their lives, my mind was populated with all kinds of Koreans who had adventures. I knew that Koreans could leave their birthplace, survive wars, start again in the middle of their lives, build businesses, steal from each other, forgive one another, and work hard again after many betrayals. Koreans could reinvent. We could dream and we can struggle in the face of great obstacles. In the absence of an American narrative about Koreans, my mother and father created counter-narratives where people who looked like me could have their stories and their meaning. As you may know, Koreans began to arrive in America in the early 1900s through Hawaii, which means that we've been in this country for over 100 years. However, with the brief exception of the terrible war, Koreans are still sorely absent in the American mainstream media, culture, and history books. Is this important? I think so. The absence and erasure of real Koreans and real Asians in media, culture, and history have profoundly tragic consequences for children and adults. Everyone needs to understand her place in the world through stories. Stories give our lives significance. Stories allow us to have compassion for others and ourselves. And stories allow us to imagine different kinds of endings. In the past 10 years since the publication of my first novel, I have visited dozens of universities in this country and overseas to speak with college students. I have met Korean foreign students, Korean Americans, Korean Japanese, Korean Chinese, Korean Brazilians, and Korean adoptees of many races. And although I have met many of them who are exceptional and spectacular and amazing and whole, I have also witnessed a great deal of depression, anxiety, and isolation. What struck me each time was how often students blamed themselves for their confusion and dislocation, rather than recognizing their rejection and exclusion in the wider political and social context of immigration, racism, nativism, homophobia, sexism, and classism. Our society has denied Koreans their counter-narratives where they belong, and consequently, many young Koreans have lost their place in the world. Organizations like the Korean Community Center can serve as a light source for all kinds of Koreans. Here we can meet one another and make connections among all generations. As a child, when my parents told me their stories and their lives, I began to see my place in their story, and learning their stories allowed me to develop my own stories, where I was both a major character and a minor character. KCC functions as a larger home for many kinds of families, where all generations can find a coherent narrative to the false ones offered by the larger society. I believe that communities like ours can replicate loving families of origin, which can foster collective and individual power. As I mentioned, it is not easy for this very shy writer to stand here in this very impressive audience. However, I wanted to come here tonight because I wanted to celebrate the very difficult and important work that KCC does. As we support the elderly and the young, as we encourage those who have little power or influence, as we remember those who the majority has willfully forgotten, we witness our humanity. And as we continue to believe in each other, we take part in our greater story. Thank you for coming tonight.